Mississippi, 1854. On this plantation, people did not wake up hoping the day would be better. They woke up already tired, already afraid, already aware that whatever strength they had left would be taken from them before the sun went down. Sleep was not rest here. It was only a brief pause in suffering, and even that pause came with fear, because every night ended the same way, and with the bell. The bell rang while the sky was still dark. Its sound was dull, heavy, and unavoidable. It did not call people to work. It reminded them that their bodies no longer belonged to them. Men pushed themselves upright on aching limbs. Women swallowed tears before they reached the surface. Children rubbed their eyes and learned again that being young did not mean being spared. The quarters came alive in silence. There was no conversation, no laughter, no lingering. People moved quickly, not because they were eager, but because slowness was noticed. Slowness always had consequences. Thin shirts were pulled over sore backs. Torn dresses were adjusted without complaint. Some feet found broken shoes. Others went barefoot, skin hardened enough that stones barely mattered anymore. Hunger sat in every stomach, sharp and familiar. Hunger could be endured. It was predictable. Punishment was not. Outside, Mississippi air clung to the skin. Even before sunrise, heat pressed down like a warning. The land smelled of damp soil, rotting leaves, and sweat that never truly washed away. Cotton fields stretched farther than the eye could follow. Neat rows hiding endless hours of pain. They walked to the fields together, but alone. Families were not families here. A woman might walk beside her husband and still not dare look at him. A child might follow a parent without being allowed to speak. Love existed, but quietly, carefully, like something fragile that could be crushed at any moment. From the raised porch of the main house, Thomas Hale watched them arrive. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, posture straight, boots polished. The porch had been built higher than the land on purpose. It allowed him to see everything, and it reminded everyone below that he was above them in every way that mattered. Thomas Hale was 54 years old. His hair had begun to gray, but his body was still strong. He took pride in that. Strength meant control. Control meant survival. He believed this deeply. He did not think of himself as cruel. Cruelty in his mind was emotional, loud, uncontrolled. What he practiced was order, discipline, efficiency. But the key, people below were not people to him. They were labor, assets, costs that needed to stay low and output that needed to stay high. He watched the rows fill, eyes scanning movement like a ledger. Who bent too slowly? Who stood too long? Who struggled to keep pace? Each detail mattered. Small failures became big losses over time. An overseer waited nearby, hat pulled low, whip hanging loose at his side. He did not need instructions spoken aloud. He had worked this land long enough to understand expectations. Thomas Hale did not shout. He did not threaten. His authority lived in silence and consequences. The work began as soon as there was enough light to see. Hands reached into plants, fingers twisted and pulled. Cotton balls scratched skin raw. Thorns tore at already damaged hands. Backs bent low, staying there for hours at a time. Standing upright was a luxury. A woman near the center row worked with her head down, shoulders shaking slightly. Tears slid off her face and disappeared into the dirt. She did not stop moving. She did not wipe her eyes. Crying did not excuse anything here. Beside her, a boy no older than 10 tried to match her pace. His arms trembled with effort. His fingers were swollen and clumsy, but he forced them to keep moving. He had learned quickly that falling behind only made things worse. They had learned that pain was not temporary. It was the structure of their lives. As the sun rose higher, heat wrapped around the fields like a trap. Sweat soaked clothing until it clung to skin. Breathing became harder. Muscles burned, then went numb, then burned again. Some people whispered prayers under their breath. Not for freedom, not even for escape. They prayed to make it through the day without drawing attention. They prayed their bodies would not fail them in front of the overseer. Failure was dangerous. In the far rows, an older man began to stumble. His steps slowed. His hands missed more than they grabbed. He tried to correct himself, forcing his body to obey. But age and exhaustion had been catching up to him for months. He fell to his knees. The sound was soft, almost lost beneath the noise of work, but the overseer saw it. He always did. The overseer moved quickly, boots cutting through the rows with practiced speed. The man tried to stand before the overseer reached him. He failed. Words were exchanged, short, sharp. The man nodded desperately, trying to explain without explaining. His body shook as he forced himself upright again. Thomas Hale watched from the porch. He did not feel anger. He felt inconvenience. An aging worker meant declining value. Declining value meant replacement. Everything had a calculation. He turned away before the situation required escalation. He trusted the system. The system had always corrected itself. Inside the house, breakfast waited. Fresh bread, meat, coffee still warm. Thomas ate slowly, without urgency. There was no reason to rush. The land would continue producing whether he watched every moment or not. As he ate, he reviewed numbers in his head. Harvest projections, costs, replacement needs. He had already decided to purchase more workers before the next season. Younger ones, stronger ones. Age-reduced usefulness. That was simply reality. Outside, the work did not stop. By midday, the heat became unbearable. Sun burned skin until it darkened and cracked. Throats went dry long before permission to drink arrived. When water finally came, it was never enough. Some people began to sway as they worked. Others clenched their jaws and kept moving out of pure habit. Bodies learned to function past reasonable limits here. A young woman collapsed without warning. Her legs simply gave out. She hit the ground hard, breath knocked from her lungs. No one rushed to her. They could not. Helping meant stopping. Stopping meant punishment. Everyone nearby kept their eyes forward, hands moving, hearts pounding with fear and guilt. The overseer reached her quickly. He kicked dirt near her face and shouted for her to stand. She tried, failed, tried again, failed again. Thomas did not hear the words, but he saw the delay. He frowned slightly. Delays disrupted flow. The overseer handled it. He always did. By late afternoon, shadows stretched across the fields. Bodies moved slower now, but the pace did not change. Pain had settled deep into muscles and bones. Some people bled openly from their hands. Blood mixed with dirt until it was no longer noticeable. When the bell finally rang again, it felt unreal. People straightened slowly, carefully, as if afraid sudden movement would shatter them. They walked back toward the quarters in silence, leaning against one another when they thought no one was watching. Children limped. Women pressed hands against aching backs. Men stared ahead with empty eyes. In the quarters, some collapsed immediately. Others sat staring at walls, too exhausted even to lie down. A woman sobbed quietly into her hands, mourning a body that no longer felt like her own. They whispered to one another about nothing and everything. Small comforts, shared pain, quiet grief. No one spoke of escape out loud. Hope was dangerous. Across the plantation, Thomas Hale sat in his study. Ledgers lay open on the desk. Ink stained his fingers slightly. Numbers filled the pages, neat and orderly. They told a story he preferred. Stable output, controlled costs, growing profit. He allowed himself a small sense of pride. What he had built worked. He wrote a note to his supplier, requesting additional labor before the next season. He emphasized youth and strength. He always did. When night settled in, Thomas slept comfortably. Outside, the quarters were restless. Pain made sleep shallow. Dreams offered no escape. Tomorrow was already waiting. Thomas Hale did not know that time was watching him as closely as he watched his fields, not with anger, with patience. And patience, when it finally acts, is merciless. Pain did not end with sleep on the Hale plantation. It only dulled enough to make waking possible. The night had been restless in the quarters. Bodies shifted on hard ground, searching for positions that hurt less and finding none. Muscles cramped without warning. Old injuries throbbed like living things. Some people woke gasping from dreams they could not remember clearly, only the feeling that something terrible had been happening and never truly stopped. When the bell rang again before dawn, there was no surprise left in it. People rose slowly. Some needed help standing. Others braced themselves against walls until their legs obeyed. No one complained out loud. Complaints were remembered. Outside, the air felt heavier than the day before. Clouds sat low in the sky, trapping heat beneath them. Sweat formed on skin almost immediately. It was going to be worse today. Everyone knew it. They walked back to the fields in the same silence as always. Thomas Hale was already awake. He liked early mornings. They gave him time to think before the day demanded decisions. He washed, dressed, and stood at his window looking out over the land. The fields were filling again just as they should. No visible gaps, no disruptions. The system was functioning. That was what mattered. He had grown up poor. People often forgot that about him, but he never did. His father had owned little more than stubbornness, and a belief that hardship was the natural state of life. Thomas had learned early that comfort was earned, not given. When he finally had power, he did not intend to waste it on softness. Softness ruined men. That belief had guided him for decades. The overseer reported that one woman had been unable to work by evening yesterday. Thomas listened without expression. Illness and exhaustion were unavoidable losses. As long as they did not spread, they were acceptable. "She'll be back today," the overseer said. Thomas nodded. If she wasn't, someone else would take her place. Replacement was cheaper than recovery. Work began again as the sky lightened. Hands returned to cotton, backs bent low. The rhythm resumed, as if the night had never happened. Time blurred quickly in the fields. Hours passed without markers. The sun climbed. Heat pressed down. Breathing grew shallow. A young man near the edge of the field worked with his jaw clenched tight. His shoulders were broad, his movements strong, but his eyes betrayed fear. He had arrived only months earlier. He was still learning the rules. He worked faster than anyone around him, not because he was eager, but because he was terrified of slowing down. Terror drove his body past safe limits. Sweat poured off him. His hands shook, but he did not stop. He remembered the sound of the whip too clearly to forget it. Nearby, an older woman struggled to keep pace. Her fingers were swollen, joints stiff with age and years of labor. She fell behind by inches, then by feet. Each mistake felt louder than it was. She glanced up once, eyes darting toward the overseer. He noticed. The overseer walked toward her slowly, deliberately. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The presence alone was enough to tighten every chest nearby. She tried to move faster. Her body refused. The correction was brief and public. Thomas watched from the porch. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He told himself this was necessary. Fear kept order. Order kept profit. Profit kept the plantation alive. Without it, everything would collapse. He believed this as firmly as he believed in the ground beneath his feet. By mid-morning, the fields were filled with quiet misery. Some people cried openly now, too tired to hide it. Tears streaked down dusty faces and disappeared into shirts and soil. Others had gone numb. Their faces were blank, eyes unfocused, hands moving on instinct alone. Children worked alongside adults, their smaller bodies straining under the same expectations. A girl no older than 8 struggled to lift a basket nearly as large as she was. She stumbled, nearly falling. Her mother froze for a moment, instinct screaming to help. She did not. She stayed where she was, hands moving, eyes forward, heart breaking silently. Love was a liability here. The girl corrected herself, lifting the basket again with shaking arms. Her lips trembled, but she did not cry. She had learned early that crying invited attention. By noon, the heat became suffocating. The sun burned through cloud cover, turning the fields into an open furnace. Air shimmered above the soil. Breathing felt thick, like pulling air through cloth. Water came late and in small amounts. Tin cups passed quickly from hand to hand. Each sip disappeared instantly, doing little more than reminding people how thirsty they still were. One man collapsed face first into the dirt. This time the sound was unmistakable. Work slowed as people nearby hesitated, fear warring with instinct. The overseer reached the man quickly. He rolled him onto his back, slapped his face, shouted for him to get up. The man did not respond. For a brief moment, the field held its breath. Thomas leaned forward slightly from the porch. A body that did not rise was a problem. The overseer cursed under his breath and dragged the man out of the row, leaving a shallow trail in the dirt. He ordered the nearest workers to fill the gap. They obeyed immediately, hands moving faster, eyes down. The man was not dead, not yet. He was dumped in the shade near the quarters, left there with instructions to recover or face consequences. Thomas watched until the rows straightened again. The disruption had been contained. He turned away. That evening, storms rolled in. Rain hammered the land, turning dust into thick mud. The work did not stop immediately. It rarely did. Only when lightning cracked close enough to make even the overseer uneasy were people allowed to leave the fields. They returned soaked, shivering despite the heat, clothes heavy with mud. Some slipped and fell on the way back, too tired to be careful. In the quarters, the smell of wet earth and unwashed bodies filled the air. Coughs echoed softly. A few people tended to injuries as best they could, tearing fabric to wrap swollen joints and bleeding hands. The man who had collapsed lay on the ground, breathing shallowly. His chest rose and fell unevenly. Someone wiped his face with a damp cloth. Someone else whispered a prayer. No one knew if he would work tomorrow. Across the plantation, Thomas dined comfortably. The storm did not concern him. Rain was good for crops. Mud slowed workers, but it also made escape harder. Everything balanced out. He poured himself a drink and reviewed correspondence by lamplight. Business partners praised his efficiency. Profits were strong. Demand remained high. He felt secure. That night, the man in the quarters died quietly. There was no announcement, no ceremony. His body was discovered in the morning, stiff and still, eyes staring at nothing. People gathered around him briefly, then dispersed when the overseer arrived. Grief had to be quick. Lingering grief was suspicious. Thomas was informed over breakfast. He paused only long enough to make a note. One less, one to replace. Death was unfortunate but expected. It happened. It always had. What mattered was continuity. The fields filled again that morning. Someone took the dead man's place in the row. The gap disappeared. The rhythm resumed. Pain continued. No one spoke his name out loud. Time moved forward indifferent. Thomas Hale did not notice the change beginning inside himself. He did not notice the stiffness in his own joints when he stood too quickly. He did not notice the way his breath caught slightly on the stairs. He dismissed these things as nothing, temporary, irrelevant. Age was for weaker men. He believed that as deeply as he believed everything else, and belief, he had always assumed, was patient enough to last forever. The days on the Hale plantation began to blur together, not because they were calm, but because they were identical in their cruelty. Morning bell fields, heat pain, night repeat. Time did not move forward here. It pressed down. For the people in the quarters, the weeks felt endless. Their bodies carried yesterday's pain into today, and today's pain into tomorrow. There was no recovery, only accumulation. Every movement came with memory. Every ache reminded them how long this had been going, on and how long it was expected to continue. Fear was no longer sharp. It had settled into something heavier. Resignation. They no longer asked whether something bad would happen. They only wondered when and to whom. In the fields, discipline grew harsher. The overseer had been instructed to increase output. The market demanded it. Cotton prices were favorable, and Thomas Hale intended to take full advantage. Efficiency had to improve. Slowness could not be tolerated. That message traveled downward quickly. The overseer walked the rows more often now. His presence lingered longer. His eyes tracked movement with a predator's patience. Corrections became more frequent. Less explanation, less warning. People worked faster, not because their bodies could handle it, but because fear forced them to try. A young woman named Ruth felt the change immediately. She had been strong once, not just physically but quietly determined. She had learned how to survive by staying invisible, by blending into the rhythm of the field and never standing out. It had worked for years. Now it wasn't enough. Her hands shook constantly. Blisters had hardened into raw open wounds. Cotton fibers stuck to the blood and tore free again with every pull. She gritted her teeth and kept moving. She had 2 children in the quarters, and that was the only reason she stood at all. When the overseer passed near her row, her breathing shortened. She forced her pace faster. The pain in her shoulders flared sharply, like something tearing inside. She stumbled. It was small, barely noticeable, but it happened. The overseer stopped. The field seemed to go silent, even though work continued. Everyone nearby felt it. The pause. The shift. The moment where something bad became inevitable. Ruth straightened quickly, lowering her head, hands moving again. It was too late. The overseer stepped closer, his shadow falling across her. He spoke her name. Hearing her name spoken aloud made her chest tighten painfully. She tried to explain, not with words, with effort, with speed, with obedience. It didn't matter. The punishment was not about correction. It was about example. Thomas Hale watched from the porch. He saw Ruth's shoulders stiffen. He saw the way others nearby worked harder, faster, desperately trying not to draw attention. He told himself this was necessary. Discipline prevented chaos. Chaos destroyed profit. Profit sustained everything. He had repeated this logic so often it felt like truth. By midday, Ruth could barely lift her arms. Tears slid down her face freely now. She did not bother hiding them. Crying had lost its power to shame. Pain had erased that. Nearby, one of her children watched from a distance, assigned to lighter work but unable to look away. Fear twisted the child's face into something far too old for their age. The child did not cry. Crying did nothing. That night, Ruth collapsed in the quarters. Her body finally gave up the fight it had been forced into. She lay on the dirt floor, chest rising shallowly, eyes unfocused. Other women gathered around her quietly. Someone pressed a damp cloth to her forehead. Someone else whispered her name. They all knew what collapse meant. If she could not work tomorrow, she would be punished again. If she could not work after that, she would be replaced. Replaced did not always mean sold. Sometimes it meant buried. Ruth woke briefly, just long enough to whisper her children's names. That was all. Across the plantation, Thomas Hale slept soundly. He dreamed of numbers, of expanding acreage, of growth. In the morning, Ruth did not rise. The bell rang. The quarters stirred. Her children shook her gently, panic rising in their throats. She did not respond. The overseer arrived quickly when word spread. He checked her breathing, shallow but present. He cursed under his breath. "She'll work," he said. They dragged her upright. Her legs buckled immediately. She cried out then, a raw sound that cut through the morning air. It did not move anyone with power to mercy. Thomas was informed as he drank his coffee. "She'll recover," the overseer said. "Or she won't." Thomas nodded. He did not visit the quarters. There was no reason to. He trusted the process. Ruth was taken to the edge of the field and ordered to work. She lasted less than an hour. When she collapsed again, the punishment was worse. The message was clear. By the end of the day, Ruth did not return to the quarters. Her children waited long after dark, sitting against the wall, eyes fixed on the path back from the fields. No one came to tell them anything. No one ever did. They learned the truth in the morning, the way everyone learned these things, silently. Work continued. Another body disappeared. Another gap filled. The system absorbed the loss without slowing. Thomas Hale reviewed his ledgers that evening and noted an increase in output. He was pleased. He did not associate the number with a woman named Ruth, or with two children who no longer spoke much. Numbers were clean. Names were messy. That night something unusual happened. Thomas woke suddenly, heart pounding. For a moment he did not know why. His room was dark and quiet. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. He lay still, listening to his own breathing. It felt heavier. He sat up slowly. A dull ache ran through his chest, spreading outward. He pressed a hand against it, frowning. The pain eased after a few moments. He told himself it was nothing. Age came with discomforts. Everyone knew that. He was still strong, still in control. One strange moment did not mean anything. He lay back down and forced his breathing to slow. Sleep returned shallow and uneasy. In the morning, he dismissed the incident entirely. There was work to be done. But over the next days, small things began to change. He noticed stiffness when he stood too quickly, a tightness in his knees when he climbed the porch steps. He found himself pausing at the top, catching his breath, annoyed at the need. He did not mention it to anyone. Admitting weakness invited it. The plantation ran as it always had. Orders flowed downward. Suffering followed. Profit rose steadily. In the fields, the people noticed nothing different about Thomas Hale. From where they stood, bent under the sun, he looked as untouchable as ever. But time had begun its work. Quietly, patiently, without asking permission, the plantation did not slow down after Ruth disappeared. It never did. Loss was absorbed quickly here. A missing body created a gap, and the gap was filled. Someone else stepped into the row. Someone else carried the weight. The system depended on this quiet replacement. Grief was inefficient. Remembering was dangerous. Ruth's children were still alive. That was all anyone could say. They moved differently now, quieter, smaller somehow. The boy stopped looking people in the eye. The girl spoke only when spoken to. At night they lay close together on the dirt floor, listening to the sounds of others breathing, afraid of the silence that came when someone stopped. No one explained anything to them. Explanation implied choice. There were no choices here. In the fields the pace increased again. The overseer had been told to push harder. Not with anger. With consistency. Thomas Hale believed anger led to mistakes. Pressure applied steadily produced results, so pressure became routine. The overseer walked the rows at set intervals. Corrections happened without warning. Punishment was no longer dramatic. It was efficient, quick, public enough to be understood. People learned faster when they saw what happened to others. A man named Elijah began to falter. He was not old, but his body had been worked beyond what it could safely endure. Years of bending, lifting, and heat had worn him down. His left leg dragged slightly when he walked. He hit it as best he could, adjusting his stance, forcing weight onto the other side. Pain had become constant. He no longer remembered what it felt like not to hurt. He had a wife. She worked several rows away. They rarely saw each other during the day. When they did, their eyes met briefly, carrying messages they could not say out loud. Stay upright. Stay unnoticed. Stay alive. One afternoon, Elijah's leg gave out. It happened without warning. His knee buckled and he fell forward into the plants. The cotton scratched his face as he went down. He tried to push himself up immediately, panic flooding him. The overseer was already there. The correction was swift. Elijah stood again, shaking violently, and forced his body to continue. His leg screamed with every step. Tears ran down his face unchecked. He did not stop. By evening he could barely walk back to the quarters. That night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to his own breathing. His leg throbbed like something alive. He pressed his hands into the dirt to ground himself. His wife whispered his name. He did not answer. Answering meant acknowledging fear. The next morning, Elijah did not rise fast enough when the bell rang. The overseer noticed. From that day on, Elijah was watched more closely. Thomas Hale was informed of declining productivity in one section of the field. He frowned at the numbers. Decline irritated him. It suggested inefficiency. He asked for explanations. The overseer gave them: fatigue, injury, natural loss. Thomas nodded. Loss was acceptable. Decline was not. Replace if necessary, he said. That was the extent of his involvement. Meanwhile, something inside Thomas had begun to shift, though he refused to recognize it. His mornings were no longer effortless. He woke with stiffness in his back and shoulders that took longer to fade. His hands sometimes trembled slightly when he lifted his coffee cup. He noticed, then dismissed it. He had seen weakness in others all his life. He did not associate it with himself. When he walked the porch one afternoon, he paused halfway across, chest tight, breath shorter than usual. The sensation passed quickly, but it unsettled him. He blamed the heat. Heat affected everyone. That night he dreamed of falling. He stood on the edge of the porch, looking down at the fields, and suddenly the ground dropped away. He woke with a sharp intake of breath, heart racing. He sat upright for a long time, listening to the quiet of his house. The dream meant nothing. Dreams were imagination. He believed in what he could measure. The fields were measurable. Profit was measurable. Pain was not his concern. The next day Elijah collapsed again. This time he did not get up quickly. The overseer shouted. Elijah tried. His body refused. People nearby worked faster, terror pushing them beyond exhaustion. No one looked at Elijah directly. Seeing made it harder to keep moving. The overseer dragged Elijah out of the row. Elijah's wife saw it happen. Her hands froze for half a second. That half second cost her. The punishment was not severe, but it was enough. Enough to remind her where she stood. Enough to break whatever strength she had left that day. Elijah was left near the quarters, legs swollen and twisted at an unnatural angle. Someone whispered that it was broken. Someone else said it did not matter. Elijah lay there through the afternoon heat, drifting in and out of awareness. No doctor came. No rest was granted. He was expected to recover or disappear. Thomas Hale never saw him. He spent the afternoon meeting with a visitor, discussing expansion. More land, more output. He spoke confidently, assured of his ability to manage growth. He prided himself on control. That night Elijah's fever rose. His wife stayed with him, wiping his face with a damp cloth, whispering reassurances she did not believe. She prayed silently, not for miracles, but for mercy. Mercy did not come. By morning Elijah was barely conscious. The overseer checked him briefly and shook his head. He won't work again, he said. Thomas received the news with mild annoyance. A broken worker was wasted investment. He instructed the overseer to arrange a replacement. What about him? The overseer asked. Thomas hesitated for a moment. Do what's necessary, he said. That was all. Elijah did not return to the fields. His wife returned alone. She worked with her head down, tears falling steadily, hands moving automatically. She did not stop crying all day. No one told her to. Tears no longer slowed her pace. Her children watched her change over the following weeks. She became thinner, quieter, older. The plantation absorbed another loss. Time passed. Seasons shifted slightly. The air changed. The sun's position moved. Work remained constant. Thomas Hale's body continued to betray him in small ways. He began avoiding stairs when possible. He slept more lightly. His temper shortened when things inconvenienced him. He snapped at servants for minor errors. Control felt less secure. One afternoon he nearly stumbled while stepping down from the porch. He caught himself on the railing, heart pounding with embarrassment. No one saw. Still, the moment stayed with him. That night he stared at his reflection longer than usual. He noticed the lines in his face, the tiredness in his eyes. He did not like what he saw. In the quarters, Elijah's wife lay awake, staring into the dark, her body aching, her heart hollowed out. She did not cry anymore. Crying required energy she no longer had. The plantation continued. Pain continued. And time, indifferent and precise, continued its quiet work on everyone it touched. Time did not announce itself on the plantation. It crept in through small failures. It arrived in missed steps, in slower mornings, in hands that no longer obeyed immediately. It arrived differently for everyone, but it arrived all the same. For the people in the quarters, time meant accumulation. Every day added weight to their bodies. Every night carried pain forward instead of erasing it. There was no healing cycle, only repetition. Muscles hardened into permanent knots. Joints swelled and never fully settled again. Old injuries became lifelong companions. People learned how to work around pain instead of through it. They shifted weight to spare one knee while destroying the other. They favored one arm until it failed too. They learned which movements caused sharp pain and which caused dull pain, choosing dull pain whenever possible. Dull pain could be ignored. Sharp pain could not. The plantation depended on this quiet adaptation. It depended on people teaching themselves how to suffer efficiently. Elijah's wife Sarah learned faster than most. After Elijah was taken away and never returned, something inside her collapsed permanently. She did not scream. She did not fight. She did not beg. Those reactions belonged to people who still believed something might change. Sarah learned instead how to empty herself. She woke, worked, returned, slept, and repeated. Her hands moved automatically. Her eyes rarely focused on anything in front of her. When spoken to, she answered politely and briefly. When not spoken to, she said nothing at all. Her children noticed. They stayed close to her in the evenings, pressing against her sides as if physical contact could anchor her. She let them, but she did not hold them the way she used to. Her arms felt heavy. Everything felt heavy. She was still alive. That was all anyone could say. In the fields, the overseer adjusted expectations again. Thomas Hale wanted more. He did not say it in those words. He spoke of efficiency, of opportunity, of market conditions. But the meaning was clear. Output needed to rise. The overseer understood. He always did. Work days grew longer, breaks shortened. Mistakes were corrected immediately. There was no longer any pretense of patience. People began to drop more often. Some fainted briefly and were dragged aside until they could stand again. Others worked through fevers, coughing blood into their hands and wiping it away quickly before it could be noticed. Children's growth slowed. Their bodies stretched thin and narrow, energy diverted entirely into labor. Crying became constant background noise. No one reacted to it anymore. It blended into the sound of insects, wind, and cotton being torn from plants. Thomas Hale noticed none of this. From his perspective, the plantation was thriving. He walked the porch less now, not because he did not care, but because standing too long caused discomfort in his lower back. He preferred to observe from his study window where he could sit. This adjustment irritated him. He did not like adapting. Adapting implied weakness. He told himself it was temporary, a passing discomfort. Everyone experienced minor aches as they aged. He was still strong, still capable, still in control. He proved this to himself by pushing harder. He involved himself more directly in decisions. He reviewed ledgers obsessively. He corrected servants sharply for minor mistakes. He demanded immediate results. Control reassured him. But control was beginning to slip in ways he could not account for. One morning his hand shook so badly that he spilled coffee across his desk. The cup rattled against the saucer, loud in the quiet room. He stared at it, breathing shallowly. His hand steadied after a moment. He cleaned the spill himself, refusing assistance. He did not speak of it again. In the quarters, Sarah's youngest child fell ill. It began with a cough. Dry at first, then deeper. The child worked through it until working became impossible. Each breath came with effort. The child's chest rattled at night, the sound sharp in the dark. Sarah requested nothing. Requests invited attention. Attention invited consequences. She simply tried to keep the child upright during the day and breathing at night. The overseer noticed the child's slowing pace. Children were expected to keep up. When the child stumbled in the field, Sarah reacted without thinking. She stepped out of her row, reaching for her child. The movement was instinctive, immediate. Wrong. The correction came quickly. Sarah was punished publicly, not brutally, not excessively, just enough. Enough to remind her and everyone watching that love was a liability. The child was forced back to work. That night, the child's breathing worsened. By morning, it had stopped. There was no announcement, no pause. Sarah was told to return to work. She did. Her face did not change. Something inside her had already been destroyed. The plantation absorbed another loss. Thomas Hale signed paperwork that afternoon without reading it closely. His vision blurred slightly, lines of ink doubling before settling again. He blinked hard. Annoyance flared. He had never had trouble reading before. He blamed the light. Later that week, he missed a step descending the porch stairs and twisted his knee sharply. Pain shot up his leg, sudden and intense. He grabbed the railing, breath leaving him in a sharp exhale. He stood there for a long moment, heart pounding. The pain faded to a dull ache, but it did not disappear. He limped for the rest of the day. No one commented. They knew better. That night, Thomas lay awake longer than usual. The house felt larger now, quieter. Sounds carried differently in the dark. Every creak felt louder. Every breath felt deliberate. He found himself listening to his own body, the rhythm of his heart, the slight wheeze in his breathing, the way his joints ached even when he was still. This irritated him more than pain ever had. His body was supposed to obey. In the fields, work continued as always. Sarah returned each morning with empty eyes. Her remaining child followed her closely, quieter than before. The child worked harder than necessary, driven by fear rather than instruction. Others noticed and did not intervene. Intervention had costs. Another man collapsed one afternoon and did not get back up. He was dragged away. Someone else filled the gap. The rows stayed straight. Thomas Hale began to forget small things. A meeting time, a name, a detail in a contract he had reviewed the day before. Each lapse angered him. He corrected mistakes loudly now. He snapped at servants. He blamed incompetence. He blamed laziness. He did not blame himself. One evening, as he stood at his window watching the fields darken, a sudden wave of dizziness forced him to sit. The room spun briefly. He clenched his jaw and waited. It passed, but it left something behind. Fear, not sharp fear, a quiet, unwelcome awareness. He was not immune. He dismissed the thought immediately. In the quarters, Sarah sat against the wall, staring at nothing, her remaining child asleep against her side. She did not rock the child. She did not hum. She simply stayed still, conserving energy for the morning. Pain and time continued their work on both sides of the plantation. One openly, one quietly. Neither could be stopped, and neither cared who believed themselves untouchable. By the time spring returned, the plantation no longer felt like it belonged to him. The land still carried his name. The record still listed him as owner. Buyers still addressed letters to his house, but ownership, he was learning, was more than ink and habit. It required a body that could enforce it, and his body was failing him. It began with small humiliations that no one announced but everyone noticed. He dropped a glass at the table and could not bend fast enough to retrieve it. He reached for a ledger and missed the edge, his fingers trembling just enough to betray him. When he tried to stand too quickly, the room tilted, and he had to grip the chair until the world steadied again. Each moment passed quickly. Each was survivable. Together, they formed a pattern he could no longer ignore. He stopped riding altogether. The horse remained saddled some mornings, waiting in the yard longer than it should have, until a stable hand quietly led it back inside. From the window, the man watched this happen more than once. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he was conserving strength. But strength that must be conserved is already leaving. His days grew narrower. The house, once a place he passed through between inspections, became his boundary. Rooms he had rarely occupied now defined his world. The porch became his furthest point of authority. Beyond it, the plantation continued in his absence, guided by routines he had designed, but could no longer personally enforce. This terrified him more than pain ever had. Pain was physical. Pain could be endured. Pain did not question who he was. Irrelevance did. The overseers came to him more often now, not for instruction but for approval. They framed decisions as requests, but they were already made. He nodded because arguing required energy he did not have. Each nod surrendered something small but permanent. He began to sense when they withheld details, numbers that were rounded too cleanly. Incidents described vaguely. Delays explained without specifics. They were managing him now, not the other way around. And beneath all of it was a truth he had spent his life refusing to learn. Control is borrowed from the body. Once the body weakens, control must be negotiated. Once control is negotiated, it is no longer absolute. At night, the plantation sounded different. The groans, the muffled crying, the exhausted silence had always been there. But now other sounds threaded through them. Laughter, rare and quiet but unmistakable. Voices lingering longer than necessary after work ended. Pauses in the rhythm of labor that suggested people were taking moments for themselves when supervision lapsed. None of it was rebellion. It was adjustment. The people he had spent years reducing to labor were learning to operate around his absence. They were discovering small spaces where his reach no longer extended. They shared information. They supported the weak when possible. They covered for one another when mistakes happened. It did not make their lives good. It made them survivable. And survivable lives endure. He sensed this shift without fully understanding it. It manifested as irritation he could not explain, as a feeling that things were slipping away in ways he could not name. He ordered harsher penalties, but they arrived late. He demanded examples be made, but his presence was no longer guaranteed to accompany them. Punishment delivered by others did not carry the same weight. Fear without immediacy fades. His health worsened quickly after that. The doctors returned. This time their tone had changed. There were no suggestions of rest as a precaution. There were instructions, limits, warnings framed as inevitabilities. His heart, they said, his joints, his breathing. Years of strain catching up all at once. He listened with clenched teeth. He had spent decades deciding what others could endure. Now strangers were telling him what he could not. When he dismissed them, they did not argue. That frightened him more than their words. He began to rely on servants for tasks he once would have punished, others for needing help, with dressing, walking longer distances, carrying objects that were no longer heavy, but somehow unreachable. Each act required swallowing pride he had never practiced letting go of. He compensated with cruelty where he still could. His temper grew shorter, his voice harsher. He struck out verbally at anyone within reach. The house staff learned to anticipate his moods, to move quietly, to avoid giving him reasons to assert dominance where physical strength no longer allowed it. But even here, control was imperfect. They helped him because they had to, not because they feared him in the way they once had. Fear based on memory is weaker than fear based on presence. One afternoon he collapsed. Not dramatically. No audience. Just a sudden failure of legs as he attempted to cross a room alone. He struck the floor, hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs, and lay there longer than he would ever admit. No one rushed in immediately. That delay carved something deep into him. When help finally arrived, he was furious. He lashed out, accused, threatened, but the words sounded thin even to his own ears. He was lifted, not by force, but by careful hands that treated him like something fragile. Fragile. The word followed him into sleep that night. He dreamed differently now. Not of dominance, not of control. He dreamed of being unable to speak while others stood over him. He dreamed of needing water and not being heard. He dreamed of his voice failing when he tried to command. He woke gasping, soaked in sweat, heart racing. For the first time in his life, he began to understand fear without an outlet. The plantation did not slow for him. Crops were planted. Work continued. Profits came in. The system he had built proved resilient without his direct involvement. If anything, it ran more smoothly now that his unpredictable presence was reduced. This realization broke something in him. He had believed himself indispensable. He had justified cruelty by convincing himself that without him, nothing functioned, that his harshness was the price of order. Now order existed without him. That meant the suffering he had inflicted was not necessary. It was chosen. The thought arrived slowly, unwelcome and sharp. He pushed it away whenever it surfaced, but it returned again and again, creeping into moments of quiet. What had all that pain been for? He could not answer without confronting himself, and he was not ready for that. Instead, he fixated on loss. Loss of strength, loss of authority, loss of the fear he once inspired effortlessly. He obsessed over regaining something, anything, that would prove he was still the man he had been. But age does not negotiate. His body continued to betray him in ways both public and private. He needed help rising from bed. He struggled to eat on bad days. His hands shook when he signed documents. The signature that once sealed fates now barely legible. People noticed. Word spread beyond the plantation. Neighbors adjusted how they spoke to him. Buyers became more direct, less deferential. They sensed vulnerability the way predators sense injury. Power attracts challenge once weakness shows. He retreated further, isolating himself from situations where his decline might be witnessed. Isolation, however, magnified his thoughts. With no one to dominate, no labor to oversee, no bodies to control, he was left alone with memory. And memory is merciless when it finally has room to speak. Faces returned to him, not clearly, not individually, but as impressions, exhaustion, fear, resignation. He remembered the way people had looked at him when he decided their punishment, how small they had seemed, how certain he had been of his right. Now lying awake at night, he tried to imagine himself in their place. The attempt left him breathless. He understood then why they had cried, why some had gone silent, why others had stared past him instead of pleading. Helplessness strips language away. He lived with it now. When summer arrived, he could no longer hide the truth. He was dependent on the very system he had built to strip others of independence, dependent on people he had never considered human in the way he understood himself, dependent on routine, mercy, and patience he had never offered. And the most brutal realization of all settled into him slowly, without drama. No one was eager to help him. They did what was required. Nothing more. There was no kindness waiting for him at the end of his strength. No gratitude, no relief at his suffering. Only obligation. The same cold structure he had enforced now held him in place. By the time he fully understood this, it was too late to change anything. His body had already decided, and the lesson he had spent a lifetime teaching others had finally found its way back to him, not through rebellion or violence, but through time itself. Helplessness, once learned, does not forget its teacher. Dependence settled into his life the way damp settles into old wood. Slowly at first, then everywhere. He woke each morning not to plans but to limitations. What he could manage, what he could not. Which joints would cooperate and which would refuse. His body had become a negotiation he always lost. The house changed around him. Furniture was rearranged so he would not have to walk as far. Rugs were removed after he nearly fell. Doors were left open longer than privacy allowed. These were not kindnesses. They were accommodations, quiet acknowledgments, that the man who once demanded efficiency from everyone else now required it from those around him. He hated them for it, not openly, not with words. He hated them in the way he clenched his jaw when someone moved too slowly, even though he himself could no longer move fast at all. He hated them in the way he stared when hands reached out to steady him. He hated them because every act of help reminded him of what he had become, someone who needed. He had never respected need in others. Now it defined him. The servants moved carefully around him, speaking less than before. Not out of fear, but out of caution. He was volatile in ways that did not follow patterns anymore. Pain made him unpredictable. Humiliation made him cruel in smaller, sharper ways. He lashed out over nothing. A glass placed too far from his hand. A delay he could not tolerate. A face that did not look sufficiently lowered. But his outbursts carried no weight. No consequence beyond the moment. Once the anger passed, the reality remained unchanged. He still needed help standing. He still needed help dressing. He still needed help breathing on the worst days. Rage did not restore power. It only exhausted him faster. As weeks passed, his world shrank further. Rooms closed off. Visits declined. The porch, once a symbol of oversight, became a boundary he rarely crossed. From his chair, he could see the fields only in fragments, rows cut off by distance, figures too small to identify. He no longer knew who worked where. That knowledge had once been intimate. He had memorized strengths, weaknesses, limits. He had known exactly how far to push each person before they broke. Control had required attention. Now he could not even see their faces. This bothered him more than he expected. Not because he missed them, but because forgetting them felt like losing something that proved his importance. If he could not name them, Could he still claim ownership in the way that had once mattered to him? Paper said yes. His body said no. Letters continued to arrive. Account statements, requests, notices. He signed where he was told, his hand shaking enough to smudge ink. Each signature felt like an echo of authority rather than authority itself. He began to dread silence. Not the silence of the fields, but the silence of his own mind, where nothing distracted him from memory. In that quiet, images surfaced uninvited. He remembered a man collapsing in the heat years earlier, the way he had ordered him dragged aside and replaced without pause. He remembered a woman begging for a child to be spared, her voice breaking as she spoke. He remembered the child anyway, smaller hands trying to keep pace with adults. At the time, these moments had barely registered. Now they returned with detail he did not want. He told himself this was weakness. That sickness softened the mind. That guilt was a luxury for people who had failed. But the thoughts persisted. At night he lay awake listening to the house breathe around him, floorboards settling, distant footsteps, voices murmuring in other rooms. He imagined conversations stopping when he entered, even though he no longer entered anywhere unannounced. He suspected people spoke freely once he was out of earshot. This terrified him, not because he feared rebellion. That was no longer realistic. He feared irrelevance. The idea that his suffering meant nothing to those who had endured his. That his decline was simply another fact of life on the plantation, not a moment worth marking. He had expected fear at the end of his strength. He found indifference. One afternoon, he overheard laughter outside his window, brief, unrestrained. It stopped quickly, but not fast enough. The sound struck him harder than any insult could have. He realized then that his pain was not the center of anyone else's world. He had built a life ensuring that his moods determined the shape of everyone else's days. Now his moods were an inconvenience, nothing more. This realization hollowed him out. He attempted to reassert himself where he could. He ordered inspections he could not attend. He demanded reports with pointless specificity. He summoned people only to dismiss them moments later, satisfied only that he could still command movement. But even these gestures faded. Energy was finite now. Each demand cost him physically. Each surge of authority left him shaking afterward. Breath shallow, heart pounding erratically. The doctors returned again, summoned by others, not by him. This time there was no discussion. Only instructions delivered with professional detachment. He would need constant assistance. He would need to remain indoors. Strain could kill him. Kill him. The word landed heavily. For years, death had been an abstraction. He imposed on others indirectly. Exhaustion, exposure, neglect, he had never had to consider it as something that approached him personally. Now it was close enough to name. After that visit, he changed. Not outwardly, not in ways others immediately noticed, but something inside him shifted. The anger dulled. The lashing out decreased. Not because he had found mercy, but because fear had finally found him. Fear of the body failing entirely. Fear of pain without distraction. Fear of dying without control. He began to cooperate more, to allow help without striking out, to conserve energy even when pride resisted. Survival instincts replaced dominance. This adaptation came too late to restore anything. Outside, the plantation continued its quiet adjustment. Systems ran smoothly. Overseers managed without his constant interference. The enslaved people relied on one another more than they ever had on him. Life went on. This was the most brutal lesson of all. The world did not pause to acknowledge his decline. It did not collapse without him. It did not even noticeably change. He was being erased by continuity. On one particularly bad evening, pain kept him awake until dawn. His joints burned. His chest felt tight. Breathing required effort. He lay staring at the ceiling, counting breaths, wondering which might be the one that did not complete. In that stillness, he thought of the countless nights others had spent in pain because of him. The injuries untreated, the exhaustion ignored, the fear that sleep might not come, or that waking might be worse. For the first time, the comparison did not flatter him. It crushed him. He understood then that suffering does not balance itself neatly. That pain inflicted does not return in equal measure. What returned to him was not justice as he had once imagined it. It was comprehension. He finally understood what it meant to be trapped inside a body that would not obey, to depend on the will of others, to have no leverage but patience. He did not find redemption in this understanding. He found clarity, and clarity was unforgiving. When morning came, he was still alive, still dependent, still feared by habit but no longer respected, still the owner of suffering that had long since outgrown his ability to deny it. There would be no sudden reckoning, no dramatic reversal, no moment where the past could be undone. Only the slow narrowing of options, the slow stripping away of illusion, and the quiet certainty that the end, approaching him, would not care who he had once been. It would only care that he was weak now. And weakness, he had taught the world, deserved no mercy. The end did not arrive with ceremony. There were no gathered witnesses, no speeches, no final command shouted into silence. The man who had once ruled lives by routine and fear reached the last stage of his life the same way he had forced others to endure theirs, quietly, slowly, without choice. By then he no longer marked days by work or profit. Time was measured by pain cycles, by how long he could sit before his back demanded rest, by how many breaths he could take before his chest tightened, by whether his hands obeyed him enough to lift a cup without spilling. Some mornings he woke already defeated. Other mornings he woke confused, unsure where he was or how long he had been there. The house felt unfamiliar now, not because it had changed, but because his place in it had. Rooms he once commanded felt too large. Hallways felt longer than before. Even the bed felt like a restraint rather than a comfort. He had become careful. Every movement was deliberate. Every step planned. Falls terrified him. He knew what another collapse might mean. He knew how fragile he truly was now, even if he refused to speak it aloud. The people around him knew. They adjusted accordingly. He was never left alone for long, but he was never truly accompanied either. Someone was always nearby, listening, waiting, ready to assist, not out of concern, out of responsibility. He had built a life on obligation. Now it enclosed him. There were moments lying awake in the dark when he imagined speaking honestly, confessing something, saying words he had never allowed himself to form. But he did not know who he would speak to, or what good it would do. No one needed his explanations. The plantation had already absorbed his absence. Outside, seasons continued their steady rotation. Crops were planted and harvested. Work continued. Children grew taller. Old workers slowed and were replaced. Life endured in the way it always had, indifferent to individual decline. He heard less about the fields now. Reports came filtered and brief. He signed papers he barely read. Numbers blurred together. Profit still arrived, but it meant nothing to him anymore. What use is wealth to a body that cannot stand without assistance? He had once believed that everything could be justified by outcome. That suffering was acceptable if it produced results. That pain was merely a tool. Now pain was his environment. It surrounded him constantly, shaping his days, limiting his choices, reducing his world to what his body allowed. There was no outcome that justified it, no reward waiting at the end of endurance. It simply was. One afternoon, while being helped into a chair by the window, he caught sight of the fields in full light. For a moment, memory overlaid reality. He saw them as they had been years earlier, crowded with bent backs and moving bodies. He felt the old satisfaction stir weakly in his chest. Then the moment passed. The fields were still there, the work still being done, but he was no longer part of it. Not as overseer, not as presence, not even as threat. He was an observer now, and observers hold no power. That realization settled into him fully at last. Not as anger, not as denial, as acceptance, the kind that comes when resistance costs more than surrender. He began to speak less. Words tired him. Conversations felt pointless. He answered questions briefly, conserving energy. Silence became his default state, not because he preferred it, but because it demanded nothing. In silence, memory grew louder. He remembered faces more clearly now. Individual moments resurfaced with sharp detail. A man collapsing in the heat, a woman whispering to a child to keep moving, a boy too small for the tool in his hands, forcing himself to keep pace anyway. These were not dreams. They were recollections, and they came without apology. He tried to frame them as necessities, as products of the time, as things everyone did. But the arguments felt thin now, rehearsed for an audience that no longer existed. There was only himself to convince, and he was no longer persuaded. On his worst nights, he imagined those same people watching him now. Not with anger, not with vengeance. Just watching. Seeing him struggle to breathe, seeing him reach for help, seeing him reduced to the state he had engineered for others. The thought left him trembling. Not because he feared judgment, because he knew exactly what it meant to be seen that way. Illness progressed unevenly. Some days he seemed almost stable. Other days he could not rise from bed. The body that had carried him through decades of dominance now betrayed him without warning. Doctors spoke of inevitability, of managing comfort, of decline that could be slowed but not stopped. He heard them this time. There was nothing left to defy. As strength faded, something else emerged. Not remorse in the way stories promise. Not repentance. Something quieter and more devastating. Understanding. He understood, fully and without distance, what it meant to have no control over one's fate, to rely on others for basic needs, to be powerless in the face of systems designed without mercy. He understood that this state was not humiliating because it was weak. It was humiliating because it stripped away the illusion that power had ever made him different. He was a body, just like them, and bodies all end the same way. In his final months, visitors stopped coming altogether. Neighbors had little reason to call. Business associates had moved on. The world had adjusted efficiently to his absence. He noticed, and he understood. This too was something he had enforced. People learned not to linger where they were no longer useful. When the end finally came, it was not sudden. Breathing grew shallow. Consciousness drifted in and out. Voices became distant like sounds underwater. He spent his last hours in fragments, slipping between memory and sensation. In one of those fragments, he felt hands adjusting his position, careful, impersonal, necessary. He wanted to speak. He wanted to say something that might change how this felt. Something that acknowledged what he had done. Something that might in some impossible way balance the weight of it all. No words came. His body, which had served him so ruthlessly for so long, failed him one last time. He died as he had lived at the end. Dependent. Observed, without command. The plantation did not stop when he did. Work resumed the next morning. Bells rang. Fields filled. Life continued without pause or reflection. His death was recorded, his estate processed, his name reduced to paperwork. There were no tears for him. Only procedure. And in that the final lesson completed itself. He had spent a lifetime believing that power protected him from consequence. That cruelty could be justified by success, that others existed to be consumed by his ambition. In the end, time consumed him the same way. Not with drama, not with justice he could recognize, but with the same cold indifference he had shown to others. He lived long enough to understand what he had done, and that understanding stayed with him until the last breath left his body. That was the punishment. Subscribe if you believe some lessons come too late in life, and are worth hearing, while there is still time to understand them.